At the beginning of the new millennium, the Land Rover Defender firmly held a leading position in its narrow niche of simple, reliable, highly capable, body-on-frame off-road vehicles. And while in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, it had to compete with other vehicles in the same class, in Europe, it was left almost completely on its own. The Nissan Patrol was larger, more expensive, and less utilitarian. Prices for the body-on-frame, once utilitarian G-Class, had gone too high, pushing it into a different segment. And the only real competitor, the Land Cruiser 70, was not officially sold in Europe. Because of this, the Defender was effectively seen as a monopoly in the utilitarian off-road segment in the European market. It was bought by outdoor enthusiasts, farmers, the military, and the police, not only in Britain, but across Europe, including Italy. And this last point was something Fiat's management was not happy about, as they did not want to give up such important market segments to a foreign manufacturer. But there was a key problem. Fiat simply had nothing to offer the market or government buyers in response to the spread of the Defender. And yet, not long before that, Fiat had its own utilitarian off-road vehicle. While the first generation of the Fiat Campagnolo was a typical product of the early post-war period, with a canvas top and no real comfort features, the newer generation, introduced in 1974, was already much more refined and better suited for everyday use. More importantly, it now placed the vehicle in the same category as other utilitarian off-roaders, including the Defender. However, real competition never happened. Fiat did not actively sell it through its dealer network and invested very little in promoting it. Over 12 years of production, only about 10,000 units were sold, with most of them going to government agencies within Italy, while private sales and exports remained minimal. By 1986, when the production life of the Campagnolo was coming to an end, the SUV market was starting to shift away from pure utility toward versatility and comfort. So if Fiat wanted to compete seriously in this segment, it needed a completely new generation of off-road vehicle, which would require significant investment. In the end, Fiat chose not to go down that path and simply discontinued the Campagnola without leaving a successor. The story of the Iveco Massif, surprisingly, begins back in the 1950s, and not in Italy or the United Kingdom, but in Spain, where a state-owned company called Santana had been operating since 1956, specializing in agricultural machinery. Most likely, it would have remained a local manufacturer, largely unknown outside its region, if it hadn't received a license in 1958 to assemble the Land Rover Series 2. At the time, Land Rover itself could not keep up with demand and was actively looking for additional production capacity. The Spanish partner was chosen mainly because of the country's closed market and the need for local production. Its geographic proximity to North Africa and the Middle East was an added advantage. However, it soon became clear that the domestic Spanish market was not that large, so most of the Land Rover Santana vehicles were exported. This model worked well until about the mid-1980s. This was the same period mentioned earlier, when the SUV market began shifting toward comfort, and the clearly outdated Santana models no longer fit the new reality. At the same time, licensed production was becoming less relevant for Land Rover itself. In 1986, Spain joined the European Economic Community, and the restrictions on the domestic market were removed. Under these conditions, it became more practical for the British company to export fully built vehicles rather than maintain local production. However, already in 1985, before any formal split with the British side, but with a clear understanding of where things were heading, Santana began producing its own version of the Land Rover, called the Santana 2500. The British reacted calmly, likely understanding that without their support, the Spanish version would not become a real competitor to the Defender. And they were right. Based on outdated components and design, the Spanish Land Rover failed to compete not only with the original Defender, but also with the Japanese off-road vehicles that were entering the European market at the time. It was the Japanese, specifically Suzuki, who ultimately kept Santana from collapsing. After the failure of its own model, the company was close to shutting down production. At the same time, Suzuki was looking for a fast and cost-effective way to enter the European market, and local production was the most practical solution. At the Santana plant, production of the compact Suzuki SJ410 was launched, known in Europe as the Suzuki Samurai, and later joined by the Vitara. This partnership allowed Santana to survive, but it did not bring stability or strong profits. And just like the British before them, Suzuki began to gradually withdraw from the project by the mid-1990s. The Spanish production had always been seen as a temporary solution, and as Suzuki strengthened its position in Europe, it aimed for full independence. By the end of 2001, Suzuki production had been significantly reduced, and Santana's losses had reached an impressive 300 million euros. But it's important to remember that Santana was a state-owned company, and its production facilities were located in Andalusia, a region with high unemployment. The closure of such a large employer would have had a serious impact on the region. For this reason, the Andalusian government decided to fund the development of a new off-road vehicle. As a result, in 2002, the Santana PS10 was presented at the Madrid Motor Show, and for the domestic Spanish market, it received the rather unusual name Anibal. From the beginning, the idea behind Anibal was about preserving jobs, not making a profit. The prospects of this Spanish off-road vehicle were limited from the start. In fact, its only real advantage was a 2.8-liter diesel engine producing 125 horsepower, supplied by Iveco, which at that time was part of the Fiat group. In every other respect, it was just a slightly updated version of the Santana 2500, which itself was based on the design of a 1970s Land Rover. In practice, even these modest expectations were not met. From the start of production in 2004, just over 2,000 orders were secured for the Anibal, and this was despite the fact that the government once again supported Santana by placing large orders for the army and public services. But even that was not enough. Once again, the company was helped by outside partners. This time, it was Fiat, which still hoped, at the very least, to get its own utilitarian off-road vehicle, and at best, to challenge the Defender. The Italians used the same Anibal as the base for their new model, as they believed it was a good fit for their goals. It only needed some updates, both in design and engineering. Fiat took the design seriously and brought in Giorgetto Giugiaro, who was tasked with making the vehicle more modern while keeping its rugged and utilitarian character. The result of Giugiaro's work, together with his Ital design studio, was the Iveco Massif. At that time, Iveco mainly focused on commercial vehicles, and in the eyes of most car buyers, it remained a niche brand, known primarily in transport, construction, and logistics. Even its successful and reliable daily van could not match the recognition of something like the Ford Transit. This is exactly why the new off-road vehicle was given the Iveco name rather than Fiat, to help promote the brand. Under the hood, the Massif received a 3-liter Iveco diesel engine, available in 2 versions, producing 150 and 176 horsepower. The engine was paired with a 6-speed manual transmission. Unlike the Defender, it used a part-time 4-wheel drive system. The suspension was also different, with leaf springs on all 4 corners. The brakes were disc all around, while ABS was offered only as an option. On paper, it all looked convincing. With a more powerful engine and better off-road geometry, the Massif theoretically had an advantage in off-road capability, but at the same time it was expected to be worse on regular roads. The rear door was made wider than on the Defender, specifically to allow loading of a standard pallet. In terms of off-road ability, the Massif was well equipped. It could handle water crossings up to 50 centimeters deep, and with a snorkel, that figure could easily reach 1 meter. It was also rated for climbs of up to 45 degrees and side slopes of up to 40 degrees. All of this looked promising for those involved in the project. It seemed that the Spanish-Italian off-roader now had everything it needed to compete with the Defender. Buyers were offered 3- and 5-door versions, a pickup, and a chassis for various conversions. Pricing also played a role. The Iveco Massif was about 20% cheaper than a comparable Defender. Production was still handled at the Santana plant in Spain. Sales began in 2007, and the results were mixed. On one hand, 6,500 Massif units were sold, which was a decent result for a new model in such a narrow segment. In the same year, the Defender sold about 3 times as many units, But it is important to consider Land Rover's background, its loyal customer base, and its well-developed dealer network, which the Massif simply did not have. The Massif was sold through Iveco dealer centers, alongside trucks and vans. Obviously, this was not the best solution, but the company had no real alternative. Almost all of the Massif units sold went to private buyers. Government agencies, which Fiat had originally counted on, were in no hurry to adopt the vehicle for the military, police, or public services. And this was exactly the segment that was supposed to provide a stable, even if not large, demand. But that never happened. Realizing that private buyers were becoming the main customers, Fiat decided to adapt. In 2008, a more refined version of the vehicle was introduced under the historic name Campagnola. It was offered only as a three-door model, with an expanded list of options and a price of around 30,000 euros. It was planned as a limited run of just 499 units. Sales of the main Iveco off-road lineup continued to decline year by year. In 2009, 1,197 Massif units were sold, and in 2010, only 769. The global financial crisis of 2008 certainly played a role, but there were enough reasons for weak sales even without it. First of all, the Defender. It was slightly more expensive, but much clearer to the buyer, with a strong history, reputation, and dealer network. As a result, most buyers preferred not to take risks and chose the proven option. The situation was made worse in 2009 when Fiat Group began acquiring Chrysler, gaining access to Jeep models. Against this backdrop, Fiat decided that selling those vehicles in Europe made more sense than continuing to develop and produce Iveco off-road vehicles. As a result, the total production of the Iveco Massif, together with the Campagnola version, did not even reach 10,000 units. In 2011, production of the Massif was discontinued. The factory and offices in Spain were closed, and 1,341 people lost their jobs. The Iveco Massif remains in history as an interesting but unfortunately underrated attempt to create a competitor to the well-known British off-road vehicle. But the story doesn't end here, at least not for the Spanish Santana. At the end of 2025, reports appeared that after more than a decade of inactivity, Santana Motors had officially resumed operations. The company is returning to the market with a new model, the Santana 400 pickup, which is expected to serve as the foundation for a renewed product line. Production is set up as a CKD assembly, based on the Chinese Dongfeng Z9, with Chinese partners acting as the main investors. A network of more than 30 dealers has already been established for the European market. The new models are planned to be sold in Spain, Portugal, Italy, Andorra, and Gibraltar. That said, pickups remain one of the least popular body types in Europe, and only time will tell how successful this new partnership will be.